Before Governor Matt Mead delivers his final State of the State address to a joint session of the Wyoming legislature, he's here with us in his own office this evening, and he's ready to answer your questions. And there's lots to talk about: budget, endow, government efficiencies, certainly education, and a lot more. Capital Outlook starts now.
This program is supported in part by a grant from the BNSF Railway Foundation, dedicated to improving the general welfare and quality of life in communities throughout the BNSF Railway service area. Proud to support Wyoming PBS.
And in part by the Wyoming Public Television Endowment and viewers like you.
And we welcome our viewers to this special live conversation with Wyoming Governor Matt Mead. Governor, welcome again back to Capital Outlook.
Glad to be on, Craig. It's good to be with you. Thank you.
Before we begin, I want to encourage our viewers that they have a chance to participate tonight. They can call their questions in. We have operators standing by ready to go at 1-800-495-9788. And they can also email us at govmead@wyomingpbs.org. I'll see your questions and then we'll relay them to the governor. Governor, as we said in the tease at the top of the show, you're about ready to give your 8th State of the State address. And from a philosophical perspective, is this one more difficult for you since it's your last compared to your first?
Oh, I don't know if it's more difficult. I think each one's unique. I mean, I'm excited about it in terms of, it's the last one, and looking forward to getting it done, and hopefully we get some good success out of it. But each one's a little bit different. It's amazing that it's the 8th one. It seems like I remember the first one as if it was yesterday. So eager to get it started, and excited about some of the opportunities I see during the session.
And as we start to talk about the session, just generally, Governor, what are you thinking today? What's on your mind as you're writing that final notes in your speech?
Yeah, and just working on it today, a couple things. One is I really had, several months ago, I had my staff gather up all of the State of State addresses that have been given by governors, including before we were a state. And as you read through those State of the State addresses or State of the Territory addresses, it's interesting that world wars, the Great Depression, exciting things like putting men on the moon. There is a constant theme that we see in governors' addresses to the legislature, and that is optimism, and it's a can-do attitude. And so I'm approaching this State of the State, recognizing that Wyoming really has an opportunity to steer its own course and make its own way. And that's what excites me about Endow. It excites me when I think about some of the challenges we've overcome. This budget that I presented, my standard budget, is less than it was 10 years ago. And yet we have more savings than we did 10 years ago. And so I want to emphasize, as best as I'm able to articulate, that in Wyoming, this small state with so many wonderful resources, that while we have challenges, we can still say, here's where we want to go, and we can get there.
And one of the challenges that is going to be on top of everyone's mind, Governor, are the challenges with education. What did you think when you read and received the most recent school recalibration report that was handed back to your office?
Well, I mean, there's a lot to think about. One is, even the debate, I go back last year, some said we should do recalibration, some we should not. I submitted my budget to the legislature before we got recalibration and was hoping we'd get some more information. And where it ended up was interesting because of the cuts the legislature made last year to education, roughly $67 million. The recalibration said, in effect, put that back. But I think while I understand that most of the legislators did not receive that well, I hope that there's information in there that we can learn from. And whether or not that's the direction the legislature goes or not, I think it hopefully is somewhat educational. I think one of the things as you look at that I think is a challenge in Wyoming is if you look at our big towns and you look at what we fund education at per student in some of our big towns, it's on par with a lot of other states. But we have a lot of small towns in the state of Wyoming. And when you look at what we pay per student in those small towns, it's a lot more. I mean, maybe $30,000 per student. And, so when there's talk about how you save money, well, you look at where you're spending most of your money, but we cannot, in my view, you can't close down those small schools because in so many ways those schools are the heart of the community. We are made up of small towns, and that's an expense, I get that, but it's also sort of what Wyoming's made up of these small towns and small schools, and I think we need to continue to support them.
You still hear, though, Governor, from President Bebout, that there are responsible cuts to be made. Is that your view, that there are still responsible cuts to be made in education? If so, I'm curious as to what they might be.
I think it's a worthwhile endeavor to see how we can have savings, and
Haven't we done that now?
what we have. I think there's more to look at, whether it's transportation, whether there's opportunities to consolidate administration, but one of the other things I'm going to point out my State of the State from a pre-territory directive by a governor is the value of education and how important it is to our communities and our state, and that it is one area where the state really should focus on in terms of making sure it's well funded. And that was true pre-statehood, and I think it's true today. And so I am not one who says just take 10% off the top, or some say 15% off the top. I think you have to be much more delicate at that and not do anything that hurts the education of the kid in the classroom. And so I think as you look, we're about 3.8% cuts on education now versus 12% on government operations side. I think there's room to look there, but I don't anticipate, and I don't think we should have large-scale cuts to education that hurt. We're talking about 8th graders now. These are the ones that are going to be our workforce in not too long. And as we work on Endow, one of the things that I think is critical for Endow and diversify our economy is talk about the great education system we have in the state of Wyoming.
We'll talk about that more in just a moment, but you still, from superintendents, hear from some the drumbeat of threatened lawsuits, that our Constitution, in fact, requires you and the legislature to fund education above all else. Has that impacted your thinking about the way you're responding to
I think
education budgeting?
And I have these conversations with people, and I say we shouldn't be driven by the threat of lawsuits. We should be driven by what's the right thing to do for our students, what's the right thing to do for our state. Make those best decisions, and if people decide that they want to challenge that in courts, I mean, that's part of it. But I think you first have to decide what's right for the students and the parents and what is best for the state of Wyoming. But if you start getting mired down into, well, we shouldn't do this or we should do this, but we're worried we may get sued, I don't think you're going to get anywhere. I think we have to be more bold than that in our decision making.
Governor, you said in your budget message that, and I quote, "We have the resources to fund education in the biennium and need to consider solutions longer term."
Right.
Well, I think a good question might be why haven't those solutions been considered? Why is it that the revenue question with education has been slid aside, it seems to me, for another biennium budget?
Well, I mean, just so, and you know this, but just so our viewers know it, one of the things the legislature set out to do during the interim was have a revenue committee look at a number of different revenue options. And I think the revenue committee really worked hard, and they looked at everything: property tax, sales tax, lodging tax, hospitality tax, tobacco tax. At the end of the day, they said no. And but I do think that, I mean, the simple question for all of us in Wyoming is, listen, you've got this deficit, and you either got to cut or you got to raise revenue or you got to do a combination of both. And so even this morning in talking to legislative members, I think there is a probability that we will see some taxes this session. I don't think they're going to be property tax. I don't think they're going to be large. I think they're going to look at lodging tax and tobacco tax, which in and of itself doesn't solve the problem. But I think in combination with some of the movements that joint appropriations made in terms of how we direct the revenue we have, which some we've continued to direct into savings versus now have an opportunity to use some of that money. The legislature last session said, to the extent there's a deficit, that I'm to recommend it out of the rainy day fund, which I did. That is nice to have that as a short-term measure, but long-term it's not going to solve the problem. We either have to have a lot more mineral prices and mineral production, or we have to raise revenue. So we're in a place where we do have the luxury of time to sort of figure some of this out, but we have to look 4 or 6 years out. If things don't change, we're going to be in the hole. And I, for one, do not think you wait until you're broke to make these decisions.
Senator Peterson said that's when it's going to happen. That's when this legislature and maybe even the executive office is going to get serious about revenue or tax diversification or however you want to call it is when we're broke, and I'm wondering if that's
I think we've got to be a little more proactive than that because, I think one of the ways we've been able to attract businesses to the state of Wyoming is, sort of the stability of our financial picture. And even though we've had a downturn, they see that we're not making knee-jerk reactions to recover from something and we don't have to because we've planned for it. We've about doubled the rainy day fund in my time in office. In 10 years, the permanent fund's gone from about $4 billion to $8 billion. And so we've set ourselves up to ride through a storm out, but we don't want to wait to the last minute and have, knee-jerk reaction where we're raising taxes and hurting the businesses and the people in the state of Wyoming. And so, the lodging tax, about 80% of that's paid by out of state. And I think that's one of the reasons while the revenue hasn't gone forward with that, I think it's one of the reasons the legislature will take another look at it this session.
I want you to respond to a discussion we had with Senator Michael Van Flatern from Gillette on our Capital Outlook Budget Show preview. And he said this, Governor, he said, if we want to diversify, if we want to attract new businesses, our low taxes will not do it. Because of the downturn in the mineral industry, businesses know the other shoe's going to drop, and it's going to drop on them. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think if he's saying the other shoe's going to drop and it's going to drop on, is he saying dropping on mineral companies?
What he's saying is that when we recruit new businesses to Wyoming, that they're skittish about coming here because they know if I come here now when the taxes are low, it's not going to last. It can't last because we have a downturn in the mineral industry, and then the other shoe is going to hammer me. And I would rather have a stable, known tax structure today.
Yeah, well, I guess I disagree with him in this. I think that having low taxes, and we do have low taxes, I think that is a favorable business climate that is attractive to businesses. But I think you have to combine with that predictability. They don't want to know that they're in for 1 cent and a year later they're going to get 10 cents, right, taxed on them. And so I do think that's another reason why you have to plan long term and you can't wait, quote unquote, until you're broke. I think you have to provide that predictability to those companies. I think low taxes are a good thing for a business. But I also think, financial responsibility and financial security in the state that you're going to is important as well. And so I disagree that companies don't move here because they say we have low taxes and there's no way that's sustainable. I think we can show that we can keep low taxes in the state of Wyoming. We can diversify our economy, and we're not going to just have that other shoe fall when we're broke and put it off on everyone else.
Two more questions and then we'll move on. Who should provide the leadership for that discussion, and when should it start?
Well, I think it's incumbent upon the legislature. I think it's incumbent on me as well, and you'll see in my State of the State. I mean, I'm going to urge the consideration of those things because, 2 years ago I asked for them to form a committee to look at just education funding and see where we are. I think we need to continue to urge those things because again, while we have the luxury because of some of the savings that we've had over the last 7 years, to make last-minute decisions on revenue, I don't think is good for our citizens. I don't think it's good for businesses. So I think we have to keep this on the front burner. And, no one wants new taxes. I get that. And when we raise fuel taxes, we certainly heard about that. It's not an easy thing to do. But if we're going to diversify our economy, we have to look at not just the revenue picture, but how we are taxing people. And, when 70% comes from one source, minerals, what you don't want to do is add to that and say we're going to up that and have 80%. That would put us in a worse situation long term.
Sure. So let's start to look at that a little more closely. Your office, and rightfully so, talked about the recruitment of Weatherby to Sheridan with the 70 to 90 new jobs that will come with it, I believe, in 2019. I think the State Land and Investment Board made an investment of about $12.5 million, if I recall. But you do the math relative to non-energy jobs with taxes, Governor. And you've heard this conversation before, that the average Wyomingite receives about $15,000 a year in benefits, but pays about $3,000 a year in taxes. If that's true, and I think that it is, thanks to the mineral industry, but for these non-mineral jobs then, 90 jobs at Weatherby is putting Wyoming $1 million a year in the hole.
Yeah, I don't agree with that.
Okay.
And if you look at the value to Sheridan College, the state of Wyoming, you look at the return on investment as projected by the Wyoming Business Council, Weatherby more than pays for itself. I mean, the average salary of $60,000 a year. the added value of having another manufacturing company in the state of Wyoming that adds to, the industry that we've already built on, the firearms industry, I think it is a win. And when I hear that argument that we get $15,000 in services and we're only paying $3,000, that you need to put it in the context that if you follow that to its ultimate conclusion, the way to solve Wyoming's problem is not have anybody here. That's not the state we want to be. That's not going to keep our young people here. That's not going to diversify our economy. And so we do need to recruit those businesses, and we do need to have, as we do that, continue to look at our tax structure and seeing how we're taxing them. But to say that, whether it's Weatherby or Microsoft or Searing Industries, these companies recruited, is a bad thing for Wyoming, I don't believe it's so. And I don't believe the people who have jobs there and are making a living there feel that that's so either.
And I don't think anyone says it's a bad thing for Wyoming, but I think there are concerns about what it might mean to the state's budget down the road.
Yeah, well, if you want to look at the state's budget and where we're spending a lot of money, it's in the Department of Health, and it's particularly going to get more troublesome because we have an aging population, and we don't look at that and say, well, we need to do something about our aging population. We accept that we have an aging population, but the way to offset that is to get young workers in the state of Wyoming, and so. I hear that, but I firmly believe that having the companies that are here do well and recruiting new companies is the best way forward for the state.
Good segue into your Endowment Initiative.
Yeah.
Do you feel you have solid support from the legislature and that it'll carry forward?
I do. There's just, within the legislature in the state, I think it's a fair statement to say we hear a lot of enthusiasm. We also hear, understandably, a lot of, there's skeptics, and I understand the skepticism because I'm not the first governor to say we need to diversify our economy. I think almost every governor has said that. I think the reason we need to do a good job in expressing what's different now is, things are different now. In the 1960s, when I looked at reports in the 1960s, we didn't have some of the options we did. And in the 1970s, I think you've heard me say, there was even a plan to diversify our economy and become a Barbie doll capital manufacturing of the world. Thank goodness we didn't go down the road. What's different is that I think it's a broad brush, but I think younger generations are not just looking for a job, they want a quality of life. I think we've got that to offer, and we can compete with any state. Secondly, I think with connectivity, with broadband, we have an ability now to trade commerce anywhere in the world. I think that's a game changer for the state of Wyoming. And I also think what's different from Dow in the past is we've looked at diversifying our economy in a 4-year or 8-year cycle corresponding with governor's term in office. This is a 20-year plan. It's got to be a long-term plan. Because I have read the reports in the 60s and the 70s and 80s where governors are getting information about how you got to diversify our economy. And here we are, 70% of our revenue from one source. So it's got to be a sustained effort. Things are different now with the younger generation looking for a great quality of life with the connectivity that we have and can expand upon in the state of Wyoming. I think the time is right for us to do this. And for those who just say, it can't happen, I don't accept that, because what it really says is that our whole future is going to be destined upon perhaps who's in the White House, perhaps what the price of oil is. Certainly the can-do state of Wyoming has a greater say in its future than just saying whatever happens, happens. Let's direct our own path, and I think Endow is the way to do that.
Governor, I do want to remind our viewers that now is the time to call in with your questions. You see the number on your screen. It's 800-495-9788, and you can also email your questions to govmead@wyomingpbs.org, and we would, sooner rather than later, would be good for us to be able to see your questions. Governor, one more question about Endow that's come forward. Have we done enough to set Wyoming apart? In other words, there are also other states who are also improving broadband connectivity, who are also concerned about their infrastructure, who are also concerned about computer science in their schools. Are we separating ourselves with that initiative enough to have a major impact later?
Well, I hope so. I think it's too early to tell, but I think that part of Endow is not to diversify away from our natural strengths, is to build on our natural strengths. And you look at outdoor recreation, you look at the mineral industry, the ag industry, the tourism industry. Those are things that we have perhaps in greater degree than many other states. But I just was reading the Foxconn deal with the state of Wisconsin. All in, the state of Wisconsin's going to be in for over $4 billion. We're not going to compete that way. We're not going to compete with those sort of incentive packages. We have to compete with what our natural advantages are, and looking for those businesses like Weatherby or Microsoft or Magpool that want the Wyoming in total. Not just the low taxes, but what Wyoming means in terms of quality of life and a place to live.
Last question about Endow that we've received, Governor, is people understand that Wyoming needs to step up its game, if you will, and able to attract businesses like you just talked about. What does that mean for Grable, the smaller Wyoming towns, and Lusk, and these towns that maybe don't have the amenities that some millennials today really kind of want and need to come here?
Well, I think it's one of the reasons some of the small towns in particular, I think, are challenged because they may not have the money to have an economic development group work, and they don't have some of the economies of scale. But I think that's why, it's one of the reasons that I have continued to harp on connectivity in the state of Wyoming, is because I remember when I was campaigning in Hartville, Wyoming, I think population 62 at the time. They had broadband like 200 yards away from the town, and there was a company there that did translation services, but they couldn't get the connectivity. And in small towns, broadband can be a great game changer. You have the ability to do commerce, you have the ability to do programming, you have the ability to do telehealth, telemedicine. I think that's what we need to make sure these small towns have, because while those small towns don't have some of the economy of scale, they do have quality of life. They do have there's a unique nature to them that draws people there. And so we need to make sure that as the state goes forward, that everybody has a chance to participate in the diversification effort.
A question from a viewer in Sublette County talks about Endow and Air Service, which is one of the primary recommendations of Endow. If the Endow recommendations are adopted, specifically the Air Service recommendation, is the intent of the state to permanently subsidize air service in Wyoming. It seems like an entitlement program being established, and once again there will be no end. Also, is this the use of a direct subsidy to a specific community just another form of government picking winners? We generate significant tax revenue in Sublette County. Shouldn't we have subsidized air service too?
Yeah, no, well, the first, Sublette County does generate significant revenue for the rest of the state, that's true. So here's the Air Service Enhancement Program. Endow has said, number one priority is look at air service. That is part because some of the testimony they had, including, one of the experts from the airline industry talking about, $1.2 billion per year in commerce that's at risk. Companies that are here, companies have recruited, have repeatedly over 7 years have talked to me about air service and the lack of air service and what it means for them not to expand or a choice to move here. We have oil and gas companies who do a majority of their work in the state of Wyoming, but where are they headquartered? Not here. And part of the reason is air service. I'm not saying that's the only thing, but air service is a serious deal. And so the question I get asked is, why should we start subsidizing air service? Well, the state of Wyoming has subsidized air service since 2004. Since 2004, just state dollars, not
the ASCAP program.
Yeah, and since 2004, just state dollars, we put in, I think it's in excess of $44 million. So the question is, should we continue doing it? And if we're going to continue to do it, how do we do it in a way that pays off? How do we do it in a way that cracks the code and actually tips the point where we have better air service in the state of Wyoming? And can we do it in a way that is self-sustaining so we're not on this now 14-year trend of subsidizing air service, and we still haven't cracked the code? And so I think that's what Endow wants to do, is air service is number one priority. How do we do a better job with it now in the short term with the $15 million to guarantee contracts to get some competitiveness in here and to start driving it so that it can be self-sustaining. We don't have to continue to subsidize as we have for the last 14 years.
Just a note to our viewers, 2 weeks from tomorrow, we'll dive deeper into air service in Wyoming with Director Panos from the Wyoming Department of Transportation and Amy Surdam, the administrator for the the Division of Aviation within the department. Governor, let's go to healthcare in Wyoming. You fought twice hard for Medicaid expansion. Do you have the will to do it again? And if not, why not?
Well, I may have the will. I just don't think it's practically going to happen. A couple things. One is, I still think about the people who are uninsured in the state of Wyoming. As we've worked on Endow, I've gotten letters from people who say, one of the problems with diversifying and building your economy is healthcare costs in the state of Wyoming. It's a challenge we have not met in the state of Wyoming. We still have we have the highest healthcare costs in the country for a state. And as you know, I was one of the first on board fighting the ACA, commonly called Obamacare, and we lost. And at that point, I thought we need to make the best of a situation that would help the people in the state of Wyoming, 20,000 plus, that are left in the gaps. The reason I think it's not doable now is a couple things. One is, as time has gone on, the federal match has decreased and the state match has increased. So if we weren't
0% to now
10%. Yeah. So if we weren't in for when it was good times, I doubt the legislature would do it now when the state would have to pay more. That's one. Two is, I think with President Trump in office, with a change in the tax code, I think it's even more uncertain what's going to happen with the ACA and as a whole as we move forward. And so practically, I think that the two times I tried were the best times to try it. I couldn't get it done then. I failed to get it done then, I should say.
Set aside the 20,000 not insured. Governor, what about the argument that rural hospitals now are really struggling in Wyoming and it's getting worse?
That was one of the reasons I argued for it, is we have hospitals in the state of Wyoming, small hospitals that are operating on 60 or 90 days cash. And when you're that close to the limit, you can see that a couple of bad months and you can close up. And when those hospitals close up, it's certainly a healthcare issue, but it's also an economic issue. How are we going to get companies to move into that town where they don't know that they can get emergency medical services when they break their arm? And so I would say this, is that I don't think there's a chance that we're going to do Medicaid expansion in the state of Wyoming now. But it is something that we have to recognize. You can blame it on the ACA, or if you're a Democrat, you can blame it on Trump. But that's not getting us anywhere. We have the highest health care costs. We have to look at something innovative, whether it's a revamp of Healthy Frontiers, which I supported, which fell out of the way. Whether it is looking at, the state insures a lot of people, or is there a way to build that pool to have private sector involved in that? I think those are things that we ought to look at, because it is a sticking point for us as a state in terms of health care, individual health care, and it's a sticking point in terms of building our economy.
Philosophically, Governor, do you believe health care is a right?
I don't know that it's a right. I think it's a practical matter, though. It is part and parcel of what we've come to expect, and I think it's companies provide health care. I think that the physicians, healthcare providers in this country as a whole have done such a tremendous job that the days of the past, the 50 years ago, where you just didn't have an anticipation. I think there's an expectation. I don't know that I would call it a right, but I think that there's a need.
Do you expect anything at all to happen relative to health care in this session?
I don't, other than I think that there are some in the legislature that I've spoken to who are willing to take a look at, maybe doing something completely different than any other state. How do we maximize our buying power with the state and the citizens of Wyoming? We've already passed legislation, as you know, to allow to be able to buy insurance across the state lines. But still, insurance companies look at us and see the high costs. They don't want to come into Wyoming. So we may have to do something that is completely unique to a rural state that hasn't been done elsewhere. And I think we should challenge ourselves to be able to look at that without constraints as to whether or not somebody else has done it or not.
On to other topics, Governor. The state hospital bids came back somewhat higher than expected. Do you expect that project to be able to move forward? And also with the work scheduled for the Life Resource Center, is it going to be one and not the other? Or do you perceive that both of those projects, the remodeling of the state hospital and the remodeling of the Life Resource Center, can progress?
It's unfortunate, both of them. They both came back higher. We just got the Life Resource Center yesterday or the day before, I can't remember, and both of them came back higher. Here's what I'd say about that is that, I think we're going to have to work with the contractors to see, whether we not do everything we want or to value engineer it. But I think it would be a mistake not to go forward with both projects. A couple things. One is there's been a magnificent group that's worked on that with legislators. I think they've come a long ways. I asked for that money for the state hospital, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago. We face conditions in some part of the hospital that are just not acceptable, and the same in the Life Resource Center. And what the Department of Health is trying to do is to make sure they're being efficient by having the right people in the right facility, and that's a long-term plan. But I think this is the time to do it. We've worked on it. I don't think prices are going to be going down anytime soon. I think it's just going to be more expensive if you wait. And I think to put it off now would lose the good work of many in the legislature and otherwise who worked on that a long time. So I'm going to push to get those done. Both projects.
Mm-hmm. On to the prison. It seems to me, Governor, that you've settled on maybe extreme maintenance is better than rebuilding at the state penitentiary in Rawlins. It might be better for Wyoming, certainly less expensive. Is that accurate?
Well, there's no question it's less expensive. My concern has been and still is somewhat, the legislature, I think, put forward, I think it was $14 million to make fixes on it, and we've spent that, and now we've got to ask for some more money to fix it. I'm hoping those fixes work because it's certainly significantly less than building a new one or a major overhaul. I think it was about an $80 million price tag. It was a major overhaul. So that would be a huge savings. What time will tell, though, and what I don't want to do is Band-Aid fix it $10 million a year for 10 years and say, geez, we should have gone back. And so what we have seen now with the changes they've made, I'm more hopeful than I was. I'm hoping this is going to work, and I think there's a reasonable hope for that it will work.
Do you still think that a new prison constructed in Wyoming is in our future, given recidivism rates, crime rates, et cetera? Or do you think that this will save the day, if you will, for quite a while?
Well, I think at some point in time, just because of population growth, we're going to have it. But, our recidivism rates in the state of Wyoming, our Department of Correction has some of the best in the country, and I think has been recognized as having the lowest recidivism rates for multiple years, so they do a good job. But, as population grows and things change, there will be a point in time. But currently, with the condition of the state pen, I'm hopeful that those changes will not require us to build a new prison, at least in the near term.
A short but complex question, Governor. Do you anticipate federal land transfers to the state of Wyoming in the near future?
You mean in an isolated way or in a major way?
Either.
Well, I think there's always an opportunity for little sections of land to be traded back and forth. But if you're talking about wholesale changes and the state getting federal land,
and I assume that's the question.
Yeah, I don't see that taking place. And I understand that there is people who feel very strongly that we should be taking the federal land. Two attorney generals in the state of Wyoming looked at that in terms of just legally, is that the way you could do? And they have both said no to that. Two is, there is value in federal land. The frustration that we have with federal land is often the management. And so what I have heard that I think makes more sense is, how do we work cooperatively with federal agencies in terms of management? And we have some areas in the state of Wyoming where there's greater management by the state. On top of that, some of the county commissioners said that, the way to do this, rather than just saying we're going to take away the federal land, is let's do a pilot project and do it 20 years, do baseline, water, air, soil, wildlife, let the state manage that section, small section, for 20 years and see if we can do a better job, both in terms of revenue and maintaining the habitat and the wildlife. Because there's a large assumption that if we get all the federal land, things are going to be better. And I go back to 2012 where we had the wildfires, where we paid $45 million as a state, and the feds had to pay more than that. There's expense associated with those lands as well. And so I hear people saying we need to take over all those federal lands, and I'm not one of those.
Sage grouse, Governor, you and the Colorado governor warned the Trump administration that they'd making big changes in the plan to protect sage grouse across the West would send a message to states not to bother working together to save species like the sage grouse. Have there been ongoing discussions relative to the way the state manages sage grouse with the Trump administration that still cause you concern today?
I think we've got I think a better working relationship with Interior now. We've always said there's always room for improvement on there, but when you look at what the sage grouse implementation team is, which started before I was in office, I don't get credit for that. But they worked a lot of years trying to figure out the plan, and they worked with oil companies and ranchers. A broad, diverse group to get to where we are. And let's not forget where they got us was a no listing on the sage grouse. And so tread carefully. First, don't do anything that gets the sage grouse listed. It would have a profound negative effect on the state of Wyoming. Secondly, there should be respect for that process because wildlife issues are complex. And when you have diverse groups working for multiple years on something that come up with a solution that works, that is not having the bird listed, to come in and say, we're going to change that. What are you going to do the next time? How are you going to get diverse groups at the table to work over 5, 7, 10 years to come up with a solution that nobody's real happy with, but everybody can live with? So I think that the better thing is, tread carefully, make changes as they're needed, but don't make wholesale changes. For example, let's do a population-based rather than a habitat-based management. And so I think we've been working through that with Department of Interior. I think they
Are you encouraged?
I am encouraged. I think they understand my position. I think that they have heard from a number of people. So I'm encouraged. We'll see where it ends up. But I've got, Deputy Secretary and I have multiple conversations, and we're both clear with one another where we are.
Two more national issues, but they've now become Wyoming issues. And the first one, Governor, is the Me Too movement. I want to ask you whether your office has a role in allegations such as those that were made, and I'll stress they're allegations that were made against the Secretary of State, or, as was in an op-ed piece in the Wyoming Tribune, allegations that may have been made against legislators. Does your office have a role in those types of, when allegations like that are made, and if so, what is it?
Well, it's new ground for us, and we've been wading through this as the allegations come out. Let me say a couple of things. One is, I think first thing, clearly our office has a role in saying these allegations, if true, are completely unacceptable. There's just no question about it. Secondly, we've had a recognition that there's 5 elected representatives of the state, each one separately. Each of them has to make their own decision when something like this happens. I don't want to reveal private conversation, but certainly we've had an opportunity, the Secretary and I have had an opportunity to have a conversation about this. I think that, we've had party conversations with the party about what to do about it. In terms of, just to go further, some say, what about removing him from office? Well, of course, the law is, malfeasance while in office. Both these allegations were, some time before he was in office. But I think that, we certainly need to send out the message this is, if true, was certainly inappropriate behavior. But the Secretary is making a personal decision on what he thinks he needs to do and not do. And I don't have authority over him to tell him to do something else or not. In terms of the legislature, I think the legislature has, in talking to the leaders in the legislature, I think they are trying to make improvements in their system. I think one of the challenges that I hear from them is we don't want to do anything that prevents somebody from reporting something, but on the other hand, we want an opportunity, if something is reported, to rightfully investigate it and figure out what the facts are. And so I think that's what they're trying to work through, and I think that's an important thing for them to do.
The DACA movement, the Dreamers, is more of a national issue, but there are Dreamers in Wyoming. Governor, have you had any conversations with our federal representatives on a need to support what I believe many are apparently is a bipartisan push to do it in Washington for many, but hasn't come to resolution yet?
I've not had that conversation with them on DACA specifically, but I will tell you that just my thoughts on immigration that are outside of the normal duties I do daily, but just as I've thought about it, both as my time as a federal prosecutor and working in law enforcement, I think that I think border security is priority one. And I think when we start the conversation on immigration on saying, here are the people you're going to remove from the United States that have been here for 20 or 30 years, I think that's a no-win conversation because understandably, you're removing people who are neighbors and husbands and wives. And so I think that the conversations should start rather than who we're going to move, is how are we going to even enforce the laws we have at the border? I think that's the important conversation to have, is before you say, here's the people we're going to move, how are we going to prevent people we don't want in the country from even coming in the country? And that's a challenge, because border security has its own political consternation that goes with it, and it's just a physical challenge. But to start the conversation, we're going to remove these people, and you've heard estimates of illegal estimates of 12 to 20 million people. We're not removing 12 to 20 million people from the United States. That's not going to happen.
Governor, you're aware too, though, that along the immigration topic, that Wyoming's still the only state that doesn't participate in the federal government's refugee resettlement program. We've talked about that before. Something you could change. Is there any interest for you to take a look at that before you leave office?
It was a frustrating thing for me, because as you pointed out, we are the only state that doesn't. And I think when we started looking at that, I think there was a natural inclination for people to say, we wanted a bunch of refugees in the state of Wyoming. My point was, we're the only state that doesn't have any idea what refugees are here or how many are here. On top of that, obviously no support system for them. But then, you saw in the papers there, a few things. There's 5,000 refugees, and there's some camp in here. There wasn't a fair discussion on that. And then the legislature, I think it was last year or the year before, I think it was the year before, decided that they were going to take a look at it. And I encouraged them to do that, because it's just from a state wanting to know what's going on within its borders. I think it's important to have that sort of program. What has happened since then, at the end of President Obama's administration, and I think President Trump has taken a look at this, I think in a good way, is what is the vetting process for those refugees? Is it rigorous enough? And you see that President Trump is trying to make it more rigorous. And I think in doing that, I think that that would hopefully alleviate some people's concerns about these refugees. Understanding that the refugees, I mean, this is something since our world wars, that's why many states have had that, is to address those people, including people that have helped our own troops over in the Middle East, when they can no longer live there because of fear of being executed, come to our country.
Governor, I want to talk about the issue of suicide in Wyoming. It's not new to your plate. It's something I think that you understand well. Wyoming ranks high amongst suicide rates. Currently, the most current statistics I've seen from 2016 is that we're third in the nation as far as the high rate of suicide. 144 Wyomingites lost their lives to suicide. Governor Smiley of the Episcopal Church wrote you a heartfelt letter. But in that letter, he said that that Wyoming isn't doing its job, and that the Episcopal Church then stepped up for 1 year, provide $100,000 to do some training around the state amongst their parishes. But he said the omission of funding for suicide prevention is an embarrassment, one that he hoped that you would rectify. Have you thought about that in this budget?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, one is I appreciate the Episcopal Church stepping up. I think that was a good move on his part, and I appreciated his letter as well. A couple things I'd point out is that, I started talking about suicide in my State of the State addresses, I think in my second year in office, and have continued to talk about suicide in my State of the State addresses, saying as a state we've got to do better. We were number one, and now we're number three. There is no cause for celebration in the state of Wyoming with regard to. It's a decimal point. I mean, it is, and it's. I mean, you don't want to be in that top tier in this case. And as we, we made cuts to the Department of Health last year, and I had urged not additional cuts to that because they do hurt these programs in terms of prevention. But I would say it is even more complex than that, because I don't think that the legislature has felt that they don't want to participate in prevention. It's just we're still trying to figure out what do we need to do, and there's studies about high altitude, there's studies about lack of access.
Is it a management problem that the legislature had with the way suicide programs were managed in Wyoming?
They did have some. They had some concerns about the groups that were getting money at the local bases weren't doing their job, and it's fair to look at that, but it doesn't mean you do away with the whole program, right? I mean, you've still got to do away. You've still got to address suicide in the state of Wyoming. There's no question. We are now, and we have been for many years, one of the worst in the country in terms of suicide. And so I'm again going to address it in the state of the state. I'm not suggesting by doing that that I'm solving the problem, but it is something we've got to keep talking about to remove the stigma and to continue to challenge ourselves on what we need to do better in the state, including, pushing people to get help when it's needed. But the bishop, I appreciated the gesture, I appreciated the money, and I think it's a good challenge for me and for the legislature to see if we can step up.
I want to talk about the report given to you by the Government Efficiency Commission that I believe Senator Perkins and Representative McGuire were the legislature's representative. They identified potential savings from $112 to $227 million. Do you see that kind of savings still out there for Wyoming government entities to become more efficient?
I would be surprised if it is that much, but as part of that, they also recommended investing quite a little money to get to those savings. And I think Senator Perkins has got a good handle on this, and I'm supportive of it. I think we need to move forward with it. What I don't know is if the legislature is willing to invest the $12 to $15 million, including hiring more people. As JEC just said, we need to cut 50 more people.
One of them would be in your office.
One would be in my office to whether or not to tackle that. I think there is, you look, for example, in efficiencies, and you see, for example, what the Department of Health has done. I think they've done some very good things. I think that we administratively, and we're going to do this as we have, we're heavy in some agencies in terms of the supervisor role, which has been happening partly because we continue to cut number of employees. I think that is something that we can look at. I think also, I hope as they look at it, there's efficiencies in a number of different ways. For example, I've asked for money for cybersecurity. We get, in the state of Wyoming, our state resources, we get roughly about 7 million attacks a month. And JAC has not agreed to that cybersecurity, but that's, in terms of where you're saving money, to have good cybersecurity seems like a good way to save some money to me. So I'm eager to work on that program. I don't know that we'll receive those sorts of savings, but I think we can receive savings. And I think we've done this, for example, DEQ did this maybe 6 years ago, just did an efficiency, and they found some money and they found some savings. And so I think it's something we as government need to continue to work on is can we do a better job in terms of efficiency. So overall, I think it's good work, and I think Senator Perkins is going to provide some good leadership in that area.
One of the issues the report pointed out, it said that there is a perceived cultural bias away from federal funds where small amounts of resistance discourage full evaluation of opportunities to gain additional funds. Yeah, do you sense that?
I think it's true. I mean, we're one of the, I think we're the only state that doesn't have a federal program in our schools to help some of our school kids. And I understand that bias. I mean, it's federal fund and there's strings attached to it. Well, that's true, but on the other hand, do you want to raise taxes just because you don't like federal money, which federal money comes from us? Mm-hmm. And so I think that we should be more open to looking at how we can do those things. Now, having said that, there is some areas where it may not be workable for the state of Wyoming, but I think in that efficiency we should be open to all of those ideas.
I'm sure, Governor, you've had feedback now from the directors involved in the $20+ million budgets with the government efficiency report. What feedback have you gotten from them? Are they on board?
Yeah, I think that,
is there some question about some of the suggestions?
I think they want to know how are you going to go about doing it. For example, in the Revenue Department, the recommendation is that the state hire more people, and I think the Revenue Department say, well, we want to do this, but is the front end going to be loaded so that we have more people to collect more taxes? We can't just say collect more taxes. So I think the agency directors, I think they're willing and able to go. I mean, this is a group that has cut their budget 4 of the last 8 years, 12.5%. They have been responsive to my requests and legislative requests to cut when needed, and I think certainly efficiency is something they'd be eager to look at.
Question from a viewer, Governor: would you sign a stand your ground law if it came to your desk?
I have to see it, and I know that I understand that's one, and I've not seen that yet. What we need to make sure of is that it is set up in a way that provides reasonable protection for the person who feels like they're being threatened without going overboard. So I have to see what the language is in the bill before I make that decision.
Governor, another question came, and this has to do, I think, somewhat with Medicaid, but it's a question relative to something that you recognized, if I recall, in your budget note, that our costs for nursing homes are increasing. And the thought is that, well, if we did a better job with caregivers, we could save money. And just anecdotally, we visited Monday with a caregiver in Riverton who told us that it's a 24/7, 365 job for her that she's willing and wanting to do for her mother. And she has felt that she's kept her mother out of the Medicaid system by being able to provide that care. Yet, she can't work. Might there be some state aid available to support her because she's really saving the state a lot of money?
Yeah, well, one of the things that
Excuse me.
this year and in past years, I've asked for some more money in terms of home-based services for that very reason, is that if we can keep people out of nursing homes, a couple things I think are generally true. One is you're going to save money as a state, and two, in many cases, it improves the quality of life because people are in their home. And so, again, in this budget, I've asked to up that home-based waiver system to allow more people to stay in their home, get care that they want in their home, and it prevents them going to the nursing home. I shouldn't say prevents them; they still have a choice, but allows them to stay home.
Delays.
It delays, and it saves money, and I think by many accounts provides a better quality of life for them to be able to stay in their home.
Governor, some people estimate that your predecessor will need to spend $1.5 to $2 million to get elected. Who knows if that's true, but I think the idea there is it might be an expensive race. Are you concerned about that kind of money in statewide elections? Do you perceive that there might be dark money behind some of those candidates? And the bottom line is, do you support the effort of Wyoming Promise to create a 28th Amendment that would overturn Citizens United versus the FEC?
Well, a couple of thoughts on one. I mean, just in full disclosure, I spent a lot of money when I ran, and it was partly because I just didn't have name recognition. So I think in terms of how much is it going to cost, I think it depends upon the candidate. Different candidates do it differently. I was the world's worst candidate in terms of asking for money. I just was no good at it, so we spent a lot of my own money to do that. So it depends on the candidate. In terms of how much it's going to cost, so it's hard to tell that, but I think $1 million is probably a generally good figure. You see in other states it continues to go up and up and up, and that's certainly been the trend in Wyoming as well. And the concern is you want a good pool of people who can get out there and run for offices, women and men, young people. And when the price goes up, I think it creates a constriction upon that, and you have fewer people that can do that, especially when it requires so much own money. In terms of the dark money, I would look forward to a way to avoid that. I mean, we've seen that.
Would you support the Wyoming Province effort then?
Well, what they're trying to do, of course, is get the constitutional amendment, and I've just met with them, I think, a couple of weeks ago, and I said, when we were talking about constitutional amendment, I'm going to move slowly on that because I think we have to move slowly. And what they would want to do is then it goes back to the states for the states to develop their own program in terms of how the funding would be allowed in their states. And I think there's merit in that. So we're still looking at that. But I would say this, I think that they're on the right track in terms of trying to get dark money out of politics. You know, when you see a brochure that says so-and-so candidate did this, this, and this, and it's paid for, it's either not known, which shouldn't be the case because it should say who's paid for, or it's paid for by some organization. You don't know who's pays for that organization. I think that's problematic because it doesn't lead to, you should be able to challenge those things when there's facts in there that are not true.
Governor, we have about 3 minutes left in our conversation. We've got several questions, not surprising to you, about marijuana. What have you learned from Colorado's experience in the last year? I would assume you would still oppose any effort to get either medical or recreational marijuana in Wyoming?
I do, yeah. I'm just steadfast in that, and I see, the number of clinics in the state of Colorado to treat drug abuse has gone up substantially in the last several years. I remember a conversation with Governor Hickenlooper, and I tell people this, and he said, you should, he said, don't go down this road until you see how it turns out for us. And so I still feel strongly about that, and my mind hasn't changed.
In the same vein, Governor, do you perceive whether there's an opioid problem in Wyoming? And I'll quickly get the next part of that question in. Why is the state loaning money to Cody Labs to make opioids that are just worsening this national crisis?
I think opioid abuse is a national problem. I understand more people die in opioid abuse now than they were of AIDS or in the height of the AIDS epidemic. There's no question it's a problem. The good news in Wyoming, we actually are going in the right trend. We're better than the country. Our opioid deaths have been going down. To answer the question, Kobe Lads, I don't think you say the way you deal with opioid abuse is not have painkillers. I think they do need to be available. You know, people with cancer going through surgery, I think they need to be available. It's a question, how are they used? Are we using them appropriately? So Cody Labs makes those, they provide those. The question is, are we prescribing them the right way? Are we as consumers using them the right way? And I think that's what we need to address. I don't think it's a question, people are saying you don't need painkillers. It's just how are we using them? Are we overprescribing them? Or are we as consumers not doing our job right in how we consume them?
A couple questions about Bitcoin, digital currencies, and blockchain technology. Are you interested in learning more?
Yeah, I think we need to move down that road. Now, Bitcoin itself, I'm not saying we invest in that, but blockchain technology, cryptocurrency, you know, you see most of the states are moving in that way, and I think that has to be something that is available in the state of Wyoming. I wish I was more of an expert on it, so we continue to try to learn more.
And I think there might be some legislation coming down the pipe.
There will be, and I think there should be.
Understand that. Governor Pete, your son was 10 and your daughter was 12 when you moved into the governor's residence. Where are you going to be next year at this time?
Well, we're going to be.
Your son's a senior, I should point out.
He'll be a senior, and he looks like he's going to go to the University of Wyoming. We're very proud of him, and my daughter's over there now. So we're living the life, having our kids here in Wyoming, and Carol and I are going to stay in this part of the state.
Do you feel called to continue a life in public service, Governor?
I view this just the greatest privilege to be governor, and I got to be U.S. attorney, and I got to be a prosecutor, and I have enjoyed very much my public service. But for me, and particularly in this office, I think public service and the political life, you get in, you get out, and you go back to the private sector, and so that's what I'm looking forward to doing.
Well, Governor, it's been a pleasure again to
Craig,
visit with you.
thank you very much for the time.
I'll let our viewers know that you can listen to the Governor's State of the State speech Monday. Wyoming PBS will broadcast that live at 10 a.m. And Governor, as I've told you before, you and members of the legislature are accessible in Wyoming. And I think I speak for our viewers, your constituents, that we really appreciate that.
Thank you, Greg. We appreciate the opportunity to have these in-depth discussions, so thanks for your work.
We'll see you at the end of the legislature.
Look forward to it.
All right,
Thank
Governor,
you.
thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Greg.
To our viewers, thank you so much. To our operators who are in Riverton tonight manning the phones, we appreciate their efforts as well. Stay with us. Beginning next Friday for the next 4 weeks, Wyoming PBS will cover the legislature, as is our tradition, from right here in Cheyenne. Until then, thank you very much for joining us.
Is supported in part by a grant from the BNSF Railway Foundation, dedicated to improving the general welfare and quality of life in communities throughout the BNSF Railway service area. Proud to support Wyoming PBS.
And in part by the Wyoming Public Television Endowment and viewers like you.